Thanks very much, Senator Grassley. If you drove past it in Chicago, you would never, ever believe what was going on in this house near a major university. It's a quiet neighborhood street, and there's nothing that stands out about this house. But for over 10 years, this has been the place where Heartland Alliance, one of the grantees, agencies, has been receiving unaccompanied children from the border. And the children stay in this house. There were about 70 of them when I visited, until they're placed. And I went there 2 years ago. I'd heard a lot about unaccompanied children. I wanted to see them. And 3 of those kids still stick in my mind. One, in fact, 2 brothers from Guatemala, young kids, didn't speak Spanish. They had a tribal language from Guatemala. And if you can imagine the challenge that faces everybody in that circumstance, to try to make sure that you understand their circumstances and to treat them fairly. Another was a 10-year-old girl who had been sent with a smuggler on a bus, and her 6-year-old brother who had Down syndrome. And she clearly had been instructed by whoever sent her, never let that little boy out of your sight. But that was what that 10-year-old girl was up against. And the other one, who still sticks in my mind, couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Little girl sitting by herself at a dining room table. And when I think about this issue, I think about those 3 groups of kids. And I would say that when we visited, the folks at Heartland said, we are worried about the very subject of this hearing today. We are worried that we are so overwhelmed with these kids, we cannot do the appropriate background checks on sponsors. We cannot monitor these situations to make sure these kids are not placed in the wrong setting. And so the administration came forward and asked for more money to deal with this. The price to be paid was that we had to agree to expedited removal for those unaccompanied kids from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And that would mean, of course, that at the border, as with Mexican unaccompanied children, they could be turned away on the spot, sent back, go back to wherever you came from. It could happen. Many of us thought that was a bad outcome. And to get more money to help these children and yet create a situation where so many would be turned away without any question was not a good outcome. So we meet today, almost 2 years later, and what I heard at Heartland 2 years ago, we're hearing again today. The resources weren't put in to meet the challenge. Let me ask 2 things. Mr. Osuna, you talked about legal representation, and you were very careful in the way you said it, because there is no requirement under law, if I'm correct, no requirement under law that we provide legal representation for these children.
That's correct, Senator.
When I read the New York Times article on this subject last year, there were a lot of volunteer immigration lawyers who were coming forward and trying to meet this need, and they were being overwhelmed. Has that changed?
No, I mean, I think we have done quite a bit better collectively as a system since the summer of 2014. The numbers have been overwhelming, and there's no, I think all the agencies up here would acknowledge that the numbers have been beyond what anybody has expected. On the legal services front, we have put a number of initiatives in place to assist with the legal representation of children, working with our partners at HHS with their programs. But clearly, and I think we've made some progress, by the way.
Let me just say, I think of those 3 kids in that circumstance, going through an administrative hearing on asylum. Can you imagine what that's like for a 6-year-old little girl who speaks only Spanish? Can you imagine what it's like for that little girl with her Down syndrome brother, or the 2 little kids from Guatemala who didn't even speak Spanish? Can you imagine that? Let me tell you what the odds are. What we're told is, between fiscal year 2012 and 2014, unaccompanied children represented by lawyers had a 73% success rate in immigration court, allowing them to stay in the U.S. By contrast, only 15% of unrepresented kids succeeded in their cases. So it seems to me, and I've introduced legislation along these lines, representation for these kids is the right thing to do, the humane thing to do. Now let me ask you, one of the things that Senator Grassley said as he closed was, we want to make sure that these kids are returned to their countries quickly and safely. Those are loaded words, but they're important words. Quickly, I think under the circumstances I've seen, I'm not sure this is an easy, quick thing to do under any situation. Safely is key. And here's what we also know. One report found that at least 83 people sent back to these countries from the United States since January 2014 were killed. often days after their deportations. What efforts do we make, if any, to make sure that when they do return to their home countries, these children, that they're safe?
Let me take that from the immigration court system, Senator. Our responsibility, our immigration judge's responsibility is to hold a fair hearing and make sure that all of the evidence is presented relevant to the particular case. We do that for all respondents, but of course, unaccompanied children have particular challenges that our judges then have to take into consideration. Our responsibility is to hold that fair hearing. We have put procedures in place in court to make sure that we have a courtroom setting that is appropriate for children to elicit their stories. We have our programs that we have put in place to try to provide some guidance and instruction and information for the custodians of children to make sure that they have as much information as possible before they go into that court hearing.
The disparity between those represented by counsel and those not represented tell a big part of this story. I happen to think we should be giving temporary protected status to the people coming from those three countries. We know what's going on down there. It is deadly, violent, exploitive, and sadly, the United States, in returning 83 of these kids, has to answer the question, did you send them back to their death? We'd never want that to happen if we can avoid it. Thank you.